All right, thank you guys. Thanks everybody for joining. My name is Nora Kern. I am the Executive Director of Walk Bike Nashville, and really excited to welcome everybody here to our 4th Vision Zero Nashville webinar. We're really excited to be co-hosting these once again with Vanderbilt University, and are really excited to have 2 speakers join us tonight to speak about pedestrian deaths and how they connect and overlap with our systemic issues around race and class that many cities, including Nashville, are facing. So today we have 2 moderators, so Veer Shah and Kamala Muller, who are both seniors at Vanderbilt University. So I'm going to turn it over to them here in just a second, but a few just quick Zoom notes. We are going to have Q&A at the end, but feel free to go ahead and throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, enter those questions into the chat or into the Q&A. We are also going to be live streaming this on Facebook and recording it. So if you have a friend who wasn't able to make it, we hope you'll share it with them next time around. And with that, I'll turn it over to Veer and Kamala.
Awesome. Thank you, Nora, for that warm introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Veer Shah.
My name is Kamala Muller.
And we are your moderators today. I am a senior majoring in human organizational development at Vanderbilt, and I'm a policy intern at the Vanderbilt Transportation and Mobility Office, and I also serve as Vanderbilt student body president.
And I'm also a senior majoring in public policy this fall, and this fall I'm working as an advocacy and policy intern with Walk Bike Nashville.
And again, thank you everyone for joining. Today we are joined by 2 amazing speakers who will be giving a presentation on the intersection of race, class, and pedestrian safety. Our first speaker tonight will be Angie Schmitt. Angie Schmitt is one of the country's best known writers and experts on the topic of sustainable transportation. She is now the founder and principal of 3MPH Consulting. In her new book, Right of Way, Race, Class, and Epidemic of Pedestrians in America, Ms. Schmitt debunks the notion that pedestrian fatalities are unavoidable and unpacks the trends in pedestrian safety that disproportionately impact people of color and people experiencing economic hardship. She was a longtime national editor at Streets Blog, and her writing has appeared in New York Times, The Atlantic, and a number of other publications.
Awesome. And our second speaker of the night will be Dr. Destiny Thomas. Dr. Thomas is the founder and CEO of Thrivance Group, a multi-regional socially responsible for-profit firm that works to make public spaces and public services more safe, healthy, and accessible, especially for Black, Indigenous, and transgender people and those with disabilities. An anthropologist planner hailing from Oakland, California, Dr. Thomas has a combined 15 years of experience in nonprofit management and project management within government agencies, including the California Department of Transportation and the City of Los Angeles. In addition, Dr. Thomas has led advancements in statewide racial equity initiatives for over a decade. Her focus has been urban planning, policy writing, and organizational development in communities most impacted by racial inequities. We're so pleased to have both of these speakers here with us tonight, and we'll now move on to their presentations. These will be followed by a short Q&A session, so please be thinking about any questions that you might have for them as they present, and drop them into the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the night. And with that, I think I'll hand over the floor to Angie Schmitt to kick things off for us.
Hi, okay, thanks so much for that really nice introduction. And it's a huge honor to be here with you bright young students and with Dr. Thomas. I'm just gonna jump right in to this presentation and start sharing my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is my book that just came out in August, and in it I try to explain this phenomenon we've seen in the last decade where we've had this enormous increase in pedestrian deaths. And I know this is something that Nashville is kind of on the front lines of. So to get started, this is an image that I used to work at Streets Blog, and every year we would have a contest, the sorriest bus stop in America. And this is one of the images that came up. I just wanted to include it because I think it's indicative of some of the conditions that pedestrians are facing across the United States. And I think one of the reasons this problem is a little bit of an equity issue. we really have sort of a two-tiered infrastructure system in the United States where people, primarily people who drive cars, but it's a little more complex than that, have really a very safe, complete system. Some people who live in walkable areas, especially wealthier, wider communities, may have the same kind of amenities for walking, but for a lot of folks who are sort of on the margins of the transportation system, relying on the bus, relying on walking, the conditions are really horrible and very unsafe. And here's a woman, obviously you can see she's sort of standing in a ditch by a high-speed road, nothing to protect her from traffic, with two young children. And I think one of the reasons we haven't seen this issue get the attention it maybe deserves is because too many of us who are in positions of authority in business or in government just don't find ourselves in this position. We come at this from sort of a privileged position and as such aren't very sympathetic to folks in this position. So here's sort of what I'm talking about. For a long time, we saw pedestrian deaths, as we do with all traffic deaths for the most part, gradually decline in the United States. And then about 2009, we saw this big reversal. And for the first few years this was happening, a lot of people, even top experts in traffic safety, sort of weren't sure what was going on, thought maybe it was a fluke, but now we know that it's a sustained trend and we have a better idea of what's causing it. And that's sort of what the focus of my presentation will be. So one of the key mistakes I think that's been made when people talk about this is they have sort of a stereotype in their head of who is a pedestrian that's getting killed. And again, I think this is sort of informed by the privilege of people who are in influential positions in media and various sectors. So when they think about, a pedestrian, this guy on the left is sort of the guy that comes to mind, because maybe, when they're driving to work in a major city like DC, maybe this is the kind of thing they see anecdotally, which is this young millennial guy, and he's very wired and he's distracted, crossing at this nice crosswalk. But I think that's really a mistake. That's the wrong way to conceptualize it. It's really more like this guy on the right who is in a more suburban location, is just sprinting across the street that doesn't have a crosswalk. That's more the type of person that's being killed. So just to talk a little bit about the demographics of who's being killed, and this has been touched on already, but this is an issue that is tied in with systemic racism, and Hispanic and Black folks and Native folks are impacted disproportionately, especially Native folks. As this graph from Smart Growth America points out, they're about 4.5 times more likely to be killed than the general population. It's also other demographic factors do play a role as well and are worth considering. Older folks are at disproportionate risk, and those over 75 are twice as likely to be killed. And this is a long-standing trend. Older people have always been at higher risk, but this is a part of the population that's really expanding rapidly right now. This is one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the United States. So the aging of the American population might in part explain in itself why pedestrian deaths have been rising. And we just haven't been doing a very good job designing our cities and suburbs for these kind of folks, especially when they're on foot. There's also a geographic element to this problem I want to talk about a little bit. And the most dangerous places in the United States to walk are almost without exception in the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt region of the United States is the most dangerous. And this has to do with the period cities developed. So some of the safest areas, and those are shown in green in the United States, are sort of these older northeastern or midwestern cities that may have developed a lot in the 20s and 30s before cars became the dominant mode of transportation in the United States. But today's really fast growing cities like Phoenix and Houston and almost every city in Florida, these are very dangerous places to walk. And they primarily developed after 1940s at the height of the auto era in the United States. And they tend to have a suburban type of street pattern that can make folks very vulnerable. So there's another demographic trend that I think is playing a role as well, and that's something called the suburbanization of poverty. So I think most of us who are engaged in this area and interested in these issues sort of understand and have heard about the suburbanization of poverty, but I just want to show, this is a map and it shows racial segregation in Cleveland. I just want to show how this has changed in the last 20 years and how the region and the suburbs are becoming a little bit more diverse and more integrated. So if you look, we don't even have the most recent census data, but if you look just 20 years ahead, we're still a very segregated region, but that's broken down a little bit, and there's been a lot of change. And that's happening across the country, and it's actually happening at a much faster and more dramatic level in growing metro regions like Atlanta and Nashville. So the third demographic trend that's happening is suburbs are becoming more diverse, and they're also becoming more diverse economically. And that means more people are out walking and trying to catch the bus in areas that really weren't designed to be safe for pedestrians. Oh, and just to get back to this issue of how this is tied in with systemic racism, just to compare in Cleveland. So here, again, this is racial segregation. And for folks who aren't familiar with Cleveland, this is concentrations of Black folks, and this orange is concentrations of white folks. And then the yellow are the more mixed areas. But if you look at, these are the most dangerous road segments in Cleveland. I think you can see they align almost exactly with concentrations of people of color, and with going back even to redlining. So just to talk about this a little bit more, every city in the United States, has these big demographic fault lines that we all sort of recognize and probably know in our own cities, but sometimes it's sort of an unspoken thing. And this is an example of one in Cleveland. This blue line shows the border between Shaker Heights and Cleveland. And this part of Cleveland is very low income part of Cleveland and almost entirely Black. And then this border here shows Shaker Heights, which is it's a mixed race suburb, but a little bit higher income. And these dots are showing these kind of crashes, these pedestrian crashes, and the severity of the crashes. And I think you can there's a very stark contrast from one side to the other. And I think it has to do a little bit with the way the city of Cleveland is managing streets, right? I think Shaker Heights has a little bit more tighter control over how fast you can drive down neighborhood streets. But also, one of the differences is I think people in Cleveland, lower income folks, are just doing more walking, doing more transit riding. So just to talk about this issue a little bit more, this is an example. I pick on a little bit Portland in my book. And in Portland, I think we all think of as a place that's really invested in a lot in biking and is thinking really hard about these kind of issues. But here's a map that Portland Bureau of Transportation produced, and it shows fatalities in 2017 and 2018. It's pretty straightforward, and they use the names of the victims, which I think is a really nice touch to help sort of humanize the problem. But as you can see, there's a huge concentration over here. They're not happening in sort of an arbitrary way. There's a pattern. And the same sort of thing we saw in Cleveland and Shaker Heights, you see in Portland. And so the demographic fault line in Portland is right here, 82nd Street. And that's the border between East Portland and the rest of Portland. And East Portland, for people who aren't familiar with the city, is lower income and much more diverse than the rest of Portland. So they produced this map of their high crash network. It shows the 30 highest crash intersections in Portland. 28 of them are in East Portland. And about 50% of all traffic fatalities in Portland happen in East Portland. That's despite the fact that only about a quarter of people living in Portland live in that side of the city. So just to give an example of like the kind of infrastructure inequality we see, here's a photo I took at, in a middle or to higher income white neighborhood in Portland over here. And here is what it looks like, what the infrastructure conditions are like on 82nd Street, which, like I said, is that big dividing line in Portland. Okay, so we have these demographic trends that are taking place across the United States, the aging of the population, the suburbanization of poverty, more folks moving to the Sun Belt. In addition, we've had this big change in the vehicle mix in the United States, and that's been really bad news for pedestrians. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about cars, and I think I'm getting a little low on time, so I'll try to rush through this. But we've had, so back in about 2012, when we were coming out of the last recession, the majority of cars being sold were sedans. About 3/4 of the cars being sold in the United States, the new cars that year, were sedans. Now we've had this total reversal. In the most recent year, about 3/4 of cars sold were either pickups, SUVs, or crossovers. So those are the new kind of vehicles Americans are driving. They're like more like trucks, although some crossovers are sort of like tall cars. But that's really bad news for pedestrians. I just use myself sort of for scale here. I'm about 5'6", and you can see this car on the left, a Honda Civic, would hit me sort of like in the knees. And then over here on the right, a Toyota 4Runner, that would hit me more like in the chest or the stomach area. It's a much more deadly place to suffer like blunt force trauma. And the Federal Highway Administration has known for a long time that these kind of cars here on the right are much more deadly to pedestrians. They are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to kill pedestrians when they strike them. And about 80% of the fatalities, there's been about an 80% increase in pedestrian fatalities over the last decade that involved SUVs. So we know that's one of the contributing factors. This is just a picture of my son when he was about 4. They create, in addition, the size of these vehicles creates huge blind zones in both the front and the back of the cars. It can be especially deadly to kids. In this picture, he's 4, but children around the age of 2 are very susceptible to being backed over or run over at a slow speed from the front. They call those front overs. The numbers are really sort of shocking. About 50 children every week in the United States are backed over, and most of them are backed over in their own driveways, and most of the time the driver is a parent or close relative. So that's all of that is very depressing. I understand. I just want to real quickly run through some solutions before we move on to the next presentation. I mean, one of the most obvious ways cities handle this is this concept called a road diet. And a great example is Queens Boulevard in New York City. This used to, in New York City, they used to call Queens Boulevard the Boulevard of Death. And 184 people were killed on this road in a period of about 12 years. But just a few years ago, they spent only about $14 million. So not a huge amount of money when we're talking infrastructure. And they sort of overhauled it. They put in this protected bike lane on the left, and they put in a bus lane, a red painted bus lane on the right. And immediately the results, immediately the deaths stopped happening. There has been a few deaths since that occurred a few years ago, but it's just a fraction of the numbers we saw before. They're also, one thing they've done in New York City that's been really effective is they've been just retiming their traffic signals. They're using something called a pedestrian leading interval. And all that does is it gives pedestrians a few seconds head start on traffic that's turning when they get the walk signals. So they can be out in the intersection where they're a little bit more visible when these cars start turning. They also use this center line. This is called a hardened center line, where they basically just place something at the center of the intersection so that cars have to make a sharper, slower left turn. Left turns, it turns out, can be pretty deadly. Another issue I think that's been sort of overlooked in planning when we talk about safety, and again, I think it comes a little bit back to privilege and the privilege of planners, and I include myself in that sort of, is streetlights. And this is a really, again, I think I'm running out of time. I'm going to sort of breeze through this, but up at the top here, we see Detroit, and here's Cleveland where I live. Notice Detroit is sort of a bluer shade. A few years ago, there was a survey, and they discovered that about 40% of the traffic lights in Detroit were not functioning. And so they did a $185 million bond issue, and they got them all working. And here's sort of what happened with pedestrian deaths. This is the 2 years where that all the street lights were replaced. pedestrian deaths sort of fell off a cliff after they did that. They declined about 30%. So street lighting is very important with pedestrian deaths. About 75% of pedestrian deaths occur at night. And again, like I said, I think it's been a little overlooked because a lot of the better off people that may be in positions of influence in planning, for example, maybe can just take for granted that the streetlights in their neighborhood will function. And that's not always the case for everyone. So in Detroit, when they got those streetlights working, they went from having about 26, 25 pedestrian deaths in dark, unlighted conditions a year to just overnight, just about 1. So that was a pretty dramatic change. And finally, I'm wrapping up here, but this is just a design intervention that I really like. And again, I think things like this have been a little overlooked. It's not very expensive. The Federal Highway Administration recommends this. It's called a pedestrian island. And I know you guys have worked a little bit on this, Bike Walk Nashville has in Nashville, and this is really nice and accessible. These only cost a few $1,000s to install. And in this case, because it's sort of in a turn lane area, it doesn't really take away any right-of-way from drivers, but it does give pedestrians, even like an older pedestrian, they'd have a safe place to wait if they couldn't make it across the intersection in one go. And I think this is a really promising type of intervention that we should see installed more often, especially in front of schools. And the main reason we haven't is just because this issue, it's not that we sort of lack the tools, it's sort of that we've lacked the political will, and it just hasn't been front of mind, it hasn't been a focus, because as I mentioned, these aren't very expensive. And in addition, I don't think this has been considered very sexy or very designy, so it's gotten overlooked. But these are the type of interventions that could make a big difference for people and not just keep them safe, but I think really improve quality of life and people's ability to be active and get about their cities and enjoy it. So with that, I just want to do a quick plug for my book. If anyone's interested in reading more about it, it's on sale now at Island Press, and you can get a 20% discount with the code Schmitt, which is my last name. And yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. And with that, we'll pass it over to Dr. Destiny Thomas to present her work as well.
Thank you very much for having me. I am in many ways a daughter of Nashville, so I'm excited to be able to sit with you all this evening and to share some of my perspectives and ideas about the topic at hand. Before I get into that, I want to apologize if we have any issues with my sound. I'm in a hotel room and my AirPods aren't working, but I want to do my best. And really, before I start, I want to acknowledge that there has been a tremendous loss of life here by virtue of traffic fatalities or traffic-related fatalities. And so, although I don't know the individual names of people who have passed, I do want to lift them up and dedicate everything that I am about to say to their memories. I attended Fisk University here in Nashville and lost my best friend, Melanie O'Brien, to a car crash. She wasn't in Nashville when she was killed, but that was a friendship that was formed here, and that experience actually propelled me into the type of urban planning and transportation planning that I do. So now I'm the CEO and founder of a company called the Thrivance Group, where we do work in the interest of racialized people to create places and spaces that are safe and that are healthy. And one of the ways that we do that is through mobility justice work. So today I want to talk a little bit about the difference between mobility and freedom of movement. Why I'm lifting this up is I think Angie has done a beautiful job of providing us with perspective about the built environment, about infrastructure, and some solutions that could really go a long way in terms of engineering. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that are coming up that don't necessarily automatically lend themselves to a safer environment just by virtue of new infrastructure. So when I say freedom of movement, what I'm talking about is the freedom to navigate and access space without fear or threat of punishment, undue harm, vigilantism, or criminalization. Why am I bringing this up? This is a concept that derives out of the 1960s, the civil rights movement. Freedom of movement is protected in the United States Constitution, and it is also a term that was commonly used by the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party, depicted here on my first slide, is an organization that, coming from the West Coast, born and raised in Oakland, California, is an organization that a lot of people don't realize played a major part in developing new concepts for urbanism on the West Coast, but really across the country. And the reason they took on this role is because of the gaps in the safety net and the literal infrastructure during times when Black communities and brown communities were intentionally disinvested in and disenfranchised. So I don't have pictures, but I have great talking points. So the first thing I want to talk about is our tendency as a field of planning to normalize disproportionality. We often see our communities spoken about within the context of maps, within the context of demographic proportions and percentages and numbers. And what happens there when we do that is we desensitize people to the loss of human life, to the death, the literal and social death that we are experiencing in our communities. And some of the things that reinforce this dynamic include historic disinvestment. I recently, was blessed to go through the process of interviewing emerging planners to work at the Thrivance group. And I was shocked to hear that a young person that was coming out of one of the most prominent planning schools in the country had never heard of redlining. In fact, the first time she'd heard of it was at her graduation because a guest speaker mentioned it. When we fail to acknowledge the history of intentional harm by way of the built environment, what we do is we sign off on or co-sign those perpetual dynamics. What I think a lot of people fail to realize is an investment in the disenfranchisement or oppression of one group will eventually grab hold of the groups that even have more power or privilege, as Angie put it. So what we are experiencing now with the increase in traffic-related fatalities in Nashville and as well as across the country has a lot to do with the intentional decisions that have been made in the past to poorly designed spaces and the amount of time and resources that it's taking us to catch up and to bring streets literally up to code and basic functionality while we are all resettling, migrating, moving around, gentrifying some of us. We're moving into places because they're affordable and not necessarily aware of why that's the case. A lot of that has to do with the built environment. We're also experiencing a trend in rapid renewal. It's something that local municipalities are encouraging and investing in. Of course, transformative projects are wonderful. But when we get rapid renewal, we fail to address the literal, in terms of the street, underlying disproportionality. I often give the example of how nonsensical it could be to see a temporary street improvement like a paint and bollard bike lane placed on top of failing concrete, or even if a new layer of asphalt has been put down, that asphalt is standing above eroding pipes full of lead, toxic soil and landfill, and in communities that are experiencing undue amounts of toxic environment. Without fixing those issues, what sense does it make to encourage people to choose any mode, whether it be walking, biking, or driving? They will still not be healthy. The next thing I want to talk about is the non-infrastructure factors. I think a lot of times we talk about our streets and the built environment in ways that suggest that these inanimate objects are humans themselves. We talk about cars killing people. We talk about the street killing people. And what we fail to realize is that it's our zoning, right? It's the fact that the routes to quality of life in certain areas are not truly routes. They're not comfortable. There's low visibility. The infrastructure has low quality, but it's not the infrastructure that's killing people. It's the people who have made the decisions and the policies to put the infrastructure there. I also want to lift up how we even quantify loss of life in the urban planning field. I remember when I was early in my days in Vision Zero in Los Angeles, and one of the white planners would mention to me that, you know, Black people in Los Angeles are more likely to die as a result of a traffic-related fatality than gunshot wounds. Now, there's something inherently racist in the underbelly of that comment in and of itself. But I can't lie, I was taken aback by and very persuaded by that statistic. Well, when I went out to engage community in South Central Los Angeles and shared that reflection and shared the number of people that had died in that intersection, you know, 10 people died last year here. The elder that I was speaking to, an elder Black woman, said to me, "That's a lie." And I thought she was going to tell me it was less people. She said, 10 people died here last month. And by the time I got through my line of questioning, what I realized was that the data that I had did not include the instances where people died by way of police vehicles or first responder vehicles or anyone acting in an official capacity when they either intentionally or unintentionally kill or injure, severely injure somebody in the roadway. Those deaths don't get added to our data set. And more likely than not, the people who are being erased from our analysis are Black and brown folks. And then lastly, to that same end, I find there to be an over-reliance on policing when there is deficit inherent in the built environment. We can't police our way out of bad engineering. We have to start investing in the communities where we've been kicking the investment can down the road for many, many generations. That same street where the woman opened my eyes to the issues with our data collection is a street that hadn't seen repairs in 45 years, and a street that was initially being slated to have a pop-up bike lane. So, and then also in an assessment of traffic policing in that area, traffic-related policing in that area, we found that there was a disproportionate number of stops and of citations happening in an environment on a so-called priority corridor or high injury network, where we have already acknowledged as a city that we haven't done our part to maintain this space. What are we enforcing? Why are we asking people to behave so-called normally in a space that we've already acknowledged is not normal? I want to dig deeper into what I mean by erasure, because what we experience in racialized bodies and other people who are living intersectional in a degree of intersectionality, you know, that doesn't afford them as much privilege and makes them more susceptible to oppression. We have to navigate the duality or double-edged sword of being erased while being hyper visible. What do I mean by that? I mean, people with disabilities literally still to this day are not included in mainstream planning efforts in the built environment. Most planners go and if maybe, pull out the American with Disabilities Act checklist, put curb ramps where they have money to do so, and keep going. And we have failed people with invisible disabilities. We have failed people in our communities that have mental illnesses. We have failed people who have poor vision, right? We've erased them from our processes while also causing them to be hyper visible and more vulnerable in that same built environment. You know, and that extends to unhoused people. it is interesting to me the extent that folks are going to redesign streetscapes and sidewalks to keep unhoused people from seeking shelter and rest in those spaces, while also refusing to plan for them or to incorporate them in the planning efforts. This also extends to our queer community. Our queer family is really suffering in this context. I want people to try to imagine what it is like to be a transgender person that is literally not even acknowledged as a person in most of our governing documents. But they are more susceptible to death, either by vehicle or other personal safety issues in the street. Folks are left out of the planning process, and where we're seeing areas that have been gentrified, we're seeing an increase in vigilantism. So I know somebody probably just asked themselves, well, what's making these folks more visible or more vulnerable in the streetscape? And it has a lot to do with vigilantism and the self-assigned police role of policing, where we have created an other, a person that is different, too different to be visible in this space, thereby making them more susceptible to being attacked and policed by other residents who deem themselves normal. I say all this to say, we can build the most beautiful streetscape, accessible to all standards in the MUTCD. But if we haven't done the work to rule out othering and racism and internalized bias from our processes and from the people who are accountable for them, then we have a long way to go in creating a structure and a structure of systems that make it so that streets are actually streets for everyone, streets that people can move through. The burden of placekeeping, right? So after we get done failing to invest in these communities, after we get done policing people to death, literally, then the burden of placekeeping falls on those same community shoulders. And I want to highlight here the beauty of the ingenuity that exists in Black and Brown communities. I know that there were elders in the community that I grew up in, the grandmothers and the abuelas, who would bring their folding chairs out to the bus stop every morning, drink coffee, drink tea with the other elders, and wait with the children at the bus stop for their bus to arrive, to make sure that, number one, the bus didn't leave them, because there is a culture of leaving Black people on the side of the road because you just don't want them on your bus or in your cab. And so the elders would monitor the streets, much like crossing guards would. And because there wasn't street furniture there, they brought their own. Also in Oakland, there was a time where we would see couches in the median, in LA too. And those things, those types of adaptations would be criminalized. I mentioned on another panel last week, thinking back to the first time I saw just a regular Huffy bicycle with a lawnmower engine on it, and seeing like young Black children really innovate and create their own motorized bicycle to get to and from quickly. A lot of those children had their bicycles confiscated, and some of them ended up in jail because of it. So where we're criminalizing the ingenuity of communities and then co-opting those interventions and calling them things like tactical urbanism and pop-up projects. So I just want to lift that up, that the burden of keeping place has always fallen on the shoulders of those who've been underinvested in and disenfranchised. And it is a difficult task to uphold dignity in the built environment while being criminalized for doing so. I want to transition to some solutions as well before I wrap up and open up questions, Q&A. There's an imperative of the collective here. And what I mean by that is community engagement means more than just showing up in a neighborhood when you have a project that you want to do to get consensus about a concept that has already been established and fully designed. That's not community engagement. And a lot of communities are becoming more and more aware of how degrading that type of transactional relationship is. And so we really, those of you who are students and emerging practitioners, need to begin to think about new ways to engage communities on a continuum, not because you want to move a project through, but because they are truly the experts of their built environment. And if we're really, really ready to get fancy, removing barriers to entry to civil service so that communities can begin to do the planning themselves. Similarly, there is a need to establish a framework for community ownership. Now, while our cities are moving towards more density in their zoning practices and encouraging people to abandon the single family housing model, we also should think about what the impact of that will be on families who are still have yet to obtain generational wealth, which historically and traditionally comes by way of participation in the real estate industry, owning property. Rather than fight that fight with folks that I know are really adamant about this, at the Thrivance Group, we've created a community ownership model that extends to transportation infrastructure. So one of the ways in housing that Black communities, historically disenfranchised communities, have begun to generate generational wealth through home ownership is through co-ops and land trusts. And when we push for more density, we put those types of collective structures in danger of being compromised for the sake of new design and zoning. So we have created a cooperative mobility hub framework so that every time a new micro-mobility intervention comes to the community, every time a tech company comes and starts putting their surveillance technology all over this place, a new transit stop, right? We want to make it so that communities have stakeholdership, fiscal stakeholdership in the revenue generated by this rapid renewal that's happening by way of transportation planning. And then lastly, which I've said already, it is time to start thinking about alternatives to enforcement. When we hear these gruesome stories about hit and runs, there's a story that's never left my consciousness. A child in Los Angeles being dragged 1,500 meters or 1,500 feet by a car after the driver hit him, and his body detaching from the vehicle and the vehicle speeding off. These behaviors exist not because we need to be tougher on crime. They exist because we have a system that is so punitive, that is so unfair, that is so broken, that nobody wants to acknowledge their wrongdoing, right? And we see this in places other than just transportation. We see it in the Me Too movement. We see it with all types of interpersonal harm. We're not going to be able to solve these issues of interpersonal harm, of what some folks call criminality, if our only solution is to throw everyone under the jail. And that's just the truth. If you want transparency, if you want honesty, if you want accountability, we need to create systems that garner that. I want to end with a couple of principles that I borrow from the womanist movement. Womanism is a cousin to feminism, but is rooted in more of a collective context. I encourage you all to read up on womanism. It is a framework and a thought space that I live in. But in these ways, womanism tells us how to show up in this work. They ask us to be audacious, outrageous, courageous. They ask us to always want to know more and to always seek depth in considering and understanding what is good for one so that we have a better understanding of what is good for all. They ask us to commit to the survival and wholeness of an entire people, not just an individualistic notion of freedom of movement in this case. Freedom of movement has more to do with widespread bodily autonomy, a collective sense of that, than individualistic notions of getting from point A to point B. It asks us to have the will, the experience, and the desire to create joy, regardless of anything that would disrupt those processes. I want to end by, I won't go through the list, but I want to end by sharing with you that at the Thrivance group, our call to action is really clear when we talk about these issues and disparities in the built environment, because at the end of the day, when you look at the statistics and the demographic profiles of people who are dying in our roadways, it's the invisible among us. It's the Black and brown folks, it's the indigenous folks, it's the queer folks, it's people with disabilities, both physical and invisible. And we have yet again to acknowledge why we're here, how we got here. So the Thrivance group has been working on a concept for spatial reparations called a comprehensive package for reparations through urbanism. We're excited to share that action plan with you January 2021. And even with all of that, with all of the interventions that Angie shared, with all of the solutions and ideas that I've shared, it's important to understand that the harm has been done. And James Baldwin talks about this in one of my favorite essays by him, where he talks about, he does this narrative about what it has been like to be in a Black body in the southern states of the United States and experiencing the wrath of Jim Crow, how brutal that was. And he has this monologue where he's moved to Paris. And for the first time while he's there on the street, he's able to experience the sensation of another aspect of his identity, his queerness. He's able to gaze at an object of his desire without fear of reprimand for that. And that moment for him is short-lived because he still holds in his body the fear and the trauma associated with living in a Black body. You could solve all these problems, but home very easily becomes an irrevocable condition for those of us who have experienced undue amounts of trauma in the built environment. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ms. Schmitt and Dr. Thomas, for your presentations. I know that I just learned a lot, and I know that was really valuable for our audience as well. So now we'll move on to a quick Q&A portion. So with that being said, our first question is, given both of your presentations, we know it's been spoken about a little, but a question students always have is, how can we get involved and actually work towards making a tangible difference? And either of you could answer, one of you, whatever each of you prefer.
I guess I'll get started. I think so I think like with the pedestrian safety stuff I talked about, which is obviously a lot more limited than what Dr. Thomas was talking about, and I'm still sort of thinking through everything she said. But, what I've been telling people when they ask me that question is some of this is sort of just like good government type stuff, good civics. So I know that Nashville has a lot of streets that are pretty hostile. So if you live in an area where you're not doing a lot of walking, I would encourage you to, try it and see how it feels. And if there is a problem, to reach out to your local officials, to maybe speak at a city council meeting, just to kind of raise your voice. Sorry, I got muted. So yeah, so to sort of raise your voice, I think get involved with groups like Bike Walk Nashville, because we need collective action, and they sort of have built some of the groundwork and infrastructure. But yeah, I would turn it over to Dr. Thomas. I'm curious what she has to say also.
The question was, what can students do? How can students get involved? It's important that students question what the heck they're learning in school. Push your institutions, push your teachers to bring in other perspectives than just the Eurocentric models of theory as well as praxis. In many cities, we experienced an uptick in traffic fatalities with the introduction of programs like Vision Zero, because culturally, it is just not in alignment with how people move. We need more perspectives on what makes place. So that's number one. And we actually have a space that we hold annually at the Thrivance group called the Unurbanist Assembly. It's a global gathering. This year we had 8,000 active participants over a period of 23 hours. We had a digital teach-in that lasted 23 hours. And it is a space where we invite what we call guest teachers to share some frameworks and some thinking around how to get involved in a new way. I would also recommend expanding your knowledge to be interdisciplinary or integral, as opposed to just learning the basics of planning. Because what you'll need is an understanding of psychology. You'll need to know about social work. You'll need to know about art. You'll need to know about dance. One of the best planners I've ever met is a choreographer, understanding the street as a choreographed movement. Tap into, especially if you're tied to a large institution like Vanderbilt with all that endowment, tap into some of the other disciplines and add some layers to your analysis so that you're not treating the street like it's a person.
So another question that we have is, what are some strategies for, in a city like Nashville, where there's kind of a more widespread lack of appropriate pedestrian infrastructure? What are your recommendations for prioritizing investment in that infrastructure in different parts of the city?
We have a strategy that we've been working with clients around on transit, but I think it applies to the built environment as well, that we call harm reductive planning. So given COVID-19, we've had to think about and borrow from the public health sector. What have they done historically to respond quickly and to be responsive to upticks in death? And they take a harm reductive approach. For us, what that means is thinking about who our mutual aid providers are, where our quality of life services are, direct services, social services, people who will be most likely to experience an increase in suffering, whether we invest or not. That's the other thing people don't realize. There are some communities that have been underinvested in for so long that the infusion of a new investment in and of itself is disruptive, regardless of what that infrastructure is. And so we know that there are communities that will be vulnerable and in danger no matter what decision we make. I recommend starting there. The communities that have been left out of our planning prioritization matrices for long periods of time. Now, is that scalable? No. Are you going to go farther, faster, cheaper? No. You're going to spend more. It's going to take more community engagement, and you're going to be planning intra-neighborhood networks shorter. But that is much more sustainable than what we have right now, which is a whole planning industry that has been built around the movement of bodies to work, the movement of fans to sports complexes. And what we failed to do is consider how people need to and want to connect to each other in their own communities. So I propose intra-neighborhood connectivity planning with a harm reduction layer of analysis added to it.
Yeah, I sort of agree. I agree, definitely. I think like obviously Black and brown communities in most places are the ones that need this infrastructure the most, but we've got to be really careful that we're not coming in thinking we have all the answers and not listening to the communities. And I think like there's been a lot of attention to walkability over the last 10 years, and yet we've still seen this big increase in deaths. And I think that to some extent that the improvements have been really poorly targeted. It's like the last neighborhoods that need them have been first in line. And even in places like Portland that have had all this attention on this issue, it hasn't been the right areas. And now they're seeing themselves falling behind on things like Vision Zero because of that oversight, basically.
Yeah, it's corridor level planning. We draw a straight line on a map. That's easy to fund, a straight line as opposed to a crooked one. And that's the extent of our analysis. And then we call those $35 million projects transformative. But no one moves through life in a straight line. You haven't transformed the lived experience or the walkability of a community by touching one block of it and taking 5 years to finish doing whatever you're doing to that one block, right? There's a need to have a targeted, concentrated approach within the neighborhood context so that we can see transformation in a way that's not harmful and speculative.
And one thing, I would echo some of what Dr. Thomas said about different groups that have been overlooked. I do think another one of the issues, one of the reasons we've sort of been going wrong is we've been planning and in our minds, and I think like planning isn't diverse enough, engineering isn't diverse enough, but like when we set out to do, for example, commute planning, which there has been way too much emphasis on commuting, which, and I think it comes from this idea of who are we planning for? And it's like a middle-aged, maybe it's a white guy, definitely like someone who's working. So at that age in their life, able-bodied, and the real people are much more diverse than that. People are using maybe they're a recent immigrant who doesn't speak English and is, relying on the bus, trying to save up for a car, for example, or someone who uses a wheelchair, even like a mother of young children who her time might be really freed up if one of her kids could walk to school, had that ability. And instead it's all been about sort of commuting. So I do think, and even there is some evidence, like I said in my book, that we have very limited evidence about this, but in some cities, a huge proportion of the pedestrians being killed, according to this very limited data, again, are homeless, are unsheltered. So maybe, it would be a little bit different approach than what we've been doing, but maybe it might be really impactful to sort of start with those kind of groups and help them sort of lead planning processes.
Okay, for our last and final question, and this is from a student, is what is the biggest obstacle from making pedestrian safety changes? Is it funding, ignorance, political will?
I think it's the political capital. Like it's like capitalism with politics, right? And that inherently, by virtue of capitalism and politics, inherently leaves out a whole lot of communities. And so you're not going to get community buy-in, nor are you going to get political will, because those two monsters, capitalism and politics, just eat at each other. It's very hard to build consensus. Again, I argue that planning should just stop being a consensus building effort. And that we take a harm reductive approach and show up and do the work. It's public works. We shouldn't be having a conversation about politics for basic infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that as well. And I do think, like, yes, we don't have the political will. And why? I do think, yes, it does come down to capitalism to some extent. Like car companies want to sell enormous pickup trucks. And, even though there's this evidence that they're killing people, killing kids, we don't have like a countervailing political movement that's been able to challenge that. So I do think political will is a big issue. And that's one of the reasons, I wanted to write the book, and because I think traffic safety has been considered really unsexy. And I think that obviously there's we have a lot of different issues right now. What's going on? Like probably traffic safety shouldn't be the top concern, right? We have so many problems, but I do think it deserves more attention sort of than it gets. And I do think a little more attention to this issue would sort of go a long way and help with help build political pressure for the reforms that are needed and the funding that's needed, because that is a piece of it as well.
So I think that wraps us up. Thank you both so much for coming today and speaking with all of us. If you are a Vanderbilt student and are listening in and are interested in working on the issues that were talked about, please reach out to Vanderbilt Student Government on Instagram at Vanderbilt Student Gov, or the Vanderbilt Transportation Office via the website. Additionally, there will be subsequent webinars in the future, so please be on the lookout for those.
Awesome. And for those of you who are here through Walk Bike Nashville, we will be continuing this important conversation during our next book club discussion, which will be on November 12th at 6:30 p.m., where we will actually be discussing Angie Schmitt's new novel, Right of Way, that she spoke about earlier tonight. And so we look forward to seeing you all there.
Again, thank you, Dr. Thomas and Ms. Schmitt, for speaking with us, for your time tonight, and just speaking with us. Again, we learned so much. And thank you for the audience for your participation. I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you so much. You guys were great. Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
I'm going out to get some Nashville food right now. See y'all later.
I'm jealous. Great.